Hey, gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire. And on this podcast, I have a very special guest, Ian O'Toole, board game artist extraordinaire. How you doing today, Ian?
I'm good. How are you doing, Liz?
I'm doing all right. Are you keeping busy with board game art even during COVID?
Yeah, I'm super busy. Nothing really has changed for me. A couple of schedules have moved around, but no, I've been pretty flat out this year.
So before we started recording, I was looking at your website and I noticed that you
hmm
used to do things like exhibition design and that you had sort of, brand
Yeah.
design, work on offer. But
hmm
you are almost exclusively board games these days, yeah?
Yeah, for the last 3 to 4 years, I've done it. I've dabbled in a few little projects, but pretty much exclusively board games. Yeah.
So I have a question for you. I know that you have a particularly good relationship with Lacerda,
hmm
but how do you decide what board game projects you're going to take? It seems like you're busy and you're in high demand. So how is that decision made on your end?
Well, first and foremost, it's often schedule based. So if a publisher, comes to me and says we need something in 2 months' time, and then that's just a no. That's a flat. It doesn't really matter what it is. Assuming that there's enough of a lead time, it's a mixture of a lot of things. Sometimes it's the designer, sometimes it's the publisher, sometimes it's just the game looks interesting. Particularly if it's something different, like something that I haven't done before. I quite enjoy doing different types of games. I'd like to do, one of every one of every type of game would be quite interesting. A lot of the time, it's the theme as well because I jump around in styles an awful lot. So if the theme is something that I haven't worked in before and I've a particular interest in, then that'll obviously attract me to it. So it's all sorts of different things.
So how do you get a sense of a game before you take a job? Do you typically go for games that are more completely developed and you are just helping to organize that idea visually? Or is your graphic design a part of the larger design process?
Again, it can kind of be both. If I have a sort of ongoing relationship with the designer, so with in Vital's case, for instance, then it's more of an involved process. I'll get involved earlier in the process and give feedback and all that sort of stuff. Um, but if it's a designer that I haven't worked with before, unless there's a particular reason why it might be beneficial, sometimes in the development they might be having issues with a certain mechanism and how to visually represent it or something like that. But unless there's a good reason, it's usually better once the game has gone through development because otherwise, I end up doing work and changing work and all that sort of stuff. So it depends really. I really enjoy the early development stages. Um, like we're just soon going to get started on Weather Machine, with which is Vital's next game. So I'm quite looking forward to that because the early stages are very free form, it's more just about discussing the game and possibilities of what we could do with it. So it's quite open and it's quite enjoyable.
For a game that's further in development, do you insist on actually playing it before you agree to become the artist or illustrator? Or do you just kind of read the rules or hear a pitch and say, I'll go for that?
No, I don't usually play it before I agree, um, but I will. Obviously, I take a good look at the game. I'll take a look at the prototype files, or sometimes there's like a Tabletopia version of it. So, the designer might be able to actually um, give me a picture, an overview of the game virtually, which is usually quite handy. So what I'm really trying to do is get a sense of the scope of the project, how many bits and pieces there are, and also to identify any areas that might be tricky or just might take more development work or things like that. But usually I'll play the game once I've committed to the project, especially if it's obviously a long game because I always like to build physical prototypes as well as possibly play virtually. But it's really important to me to get a sense of the physical object. So that can be quite time consuming if it's a big game.
Do you find that you prefer big games in terms of your own taste? I mean, your ongoing relationship with Lacerda and his designs does imply a certain tendency towards heavy euros.
Um, yeah, I think so. I couldn't do them all. I couldn't only do heavy euros because it kind of it occupies a large part of my brain while I'm working on it. So I mean, ideally, I would do one at a time, and I'd pepper that with smaller, lighter games, which I quite enjoy doing light games as well. But I find that they're often, well, by nature, just a lot more straightforward. So there's a lot less problem solving to do and all of that. So I find that my skill set is probably more better utilized with a more complex game.
What about your own preferences as a player? I mean, you got into doing illustration for board games because you were already an avid gamer. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. I I play I'm a bit of an omnigamer. I play almost every type of type of game at some point. I kind of go in waves of wanting, heavier games or lighter games, but I think at the for the longest while, I think my sweet spot has been like a midweight euro. And that's probably because I play that type of game a lot with my wife, so that just kind of works out. But I enjoy theme. I don't like the term thematic games. I have anyway, but I think you know what I mean if I say that, like your Mansions of Madness and that type of thing. I enjoy them to an extent, but I find I get in a mood where I really want to play that type of game, and then I play it, or maybe one or two, and then I'm like, okay, I'm fine for a while now until that urge overtakes me again. Euros I play pretty much consistently. I love card games. I love just trick taking games and things like that. I dabble with war games, although recently I haven't had the time to do that. But I have dabbled lightly in that arena. I don't play a whole lot of solo games, although again, I've dabbled. So every now and then I do. So I pretty much play a bit of everything.
How can you not love solo games? So I'm
Well,
joking. For those of you who don't know,
it's
Ian is the illustrator of Nemo's War, which is
yeah,
a major component, in my opinion, of the solo gaming canon of great games.
yeah. Well, interestingly, the original Nemo's War and the new edition is one of the few that I do play quite a lot. Um, I've played. I find time is also just a barrier for me playing solo games. I know that seems counterintuitive because I don't need other people. But I find my non sort of allocated gaming time is usually filled up with other stuff, and when I do allocate gaming time, it's usually with other people. So solo games I do still play Nemo's War, and I do still have my first edition copy, although I haven't played that in quite a while. But besides that, it's mostly smaller card games and things like that. I don't often look into solo variants for what are otherwise multiplayer games. I haven't really gone into that too much. But having said that, when I start a game, I basically play it solo to learn it, which is, I mean, it's not a solo variant, but I basically two-handed or four-handed sometimes just to learn the game and understand how it works. So I do spend a lot of time at a table with the game by myself. It's just I don't know if it qualifies as solo gaming.
That's fair. I'm assuming that you do that in order to understand the game spatially and come up with how you'd
Yeah.
like to contribute to its design graphically.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't. I'm not a person who can read a rule book and understand the game. I need to move it around, and especially if I'm going to work on it, it's really important.
So you have been the illustrator. Do you prefer artist or illustrator as the term?
Illustrator, very much so. Sorry, I don't take offense with somebody calling me an artist, but I never put that forward myself.
Fair enough. I I assume you prefer illustrator because you're helping someone achieve a vision as opposed to creating your own art out of the air. Is
Yeah,
that the
I just
idea?
don't like all the extra baggage that comes with the word art. To be honest, I'd prefer to be a bit more upfront about it, if that makes sense. Yeah.
What makes you cringe about the term art? Do you worry that do you worry that your
this
work is not beautiful enough to be called art? Because it is.
is a bit of a rabbit hole for me. I don't like people as how do I say this properly? It it makes me a little wary that people assess my work as art when it's not prepared as art. I
Hmm.
rarely think of it in an artistic way when I'm preparing it. So it seems unfair to me that somebody might assess it as a work of art as opposed to as a piece of illustration. And that's not to say that illustration is any less has any less value than art. I don't believe it does in any way. But I think the criteria is different, and I think the way that people observe and react to those two things is very different. Um, so yeah, it just makes me a little uncomfortable.
That's my
Does that
job. No.
does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does actually.
Okay. I mean, I'm fine with it. It doesn't. If someone calls me an artist, I'm not going to shake my fist at them. That's fine. But for me, that's not for me to decide. That's if so. Like, so my opinion on art in general is that ultimately it doesn't exist. Right? There's no such thing as art. It's just how people react to things that makes it art for them. It's a personal thing. It's like saying how big is something, right? Well, it depends, right? It depends on context and perspective. So how much or how little is something art depends on context and perspective. So the word big by itself in isolation doesn't really mean anything. And the word art in isolation doesn't really mean anything. So if someone says to me, that's a work of art, I take that to mean they really like it, basically. And they're getting something extra from it than some other people might. And I'm happy to hear that. And that's great. But I would never put forward my work and say this is objectively art because I don't think there's any such thing as something being objectively art. I don't think it exists. Does that does that make sense?
It does. So your illustrations then
Mhm.
cover
Yeah.
a wide range.
Sorry, you asked. Oh man.
So no, seriously, your illustrations cover a wide range of styles and historical periods.
Hmm.
And I find that really interesting. Do you have a favorite style that you like to work in, or is it the variety that does it for you?
Yeah, it's the variety. I don't really think I have a favorite style. I think so when it comes to illustration, I no, the answer is no. I don't really have a favorite style. I really enjoy the process of arriving at a style. And look, if historical setting is appropriate, looking at that, and that that's it's really fun to be able to find a sort of visual hook to hang a game on. Um, when it comes to graphic design and stuff, I'd say I have more of a style and a definite approach. But even that's influenced as well by the if it's research or just setting in general.
So what kind of process goes into, as you put it, arriving at a style? How do you arrive?
um, Sometimes very randomly. It depends. So the easiest, often the easiest thing is if it's a historical setting for a game, then often the style will be based around a style that existed at a time. So Lisboa is a good example of that. Um, and then it just becomes an exercise in, well, how can I apply this style to a game, and also how can I actually emulate it? Physically, can I do it? So that's quite a straightforward thing. Once I find that style, and sometimes it's a case of I make a decision early on that I'm not going to go super historically accurate. So, for instance, I did a game called The Scarlet Pimpernel, which is obviously based in a specific time period, and it has I implemented some styles of the time, sort of these watercolor travel sketching styles, but the design that it's hung around is is much more modern. So that's a decision, just a stylistic decision to be a little bit more anachronistic with that. But as regards this, the ins and outs of the style itself, if there isn't a historical context, uh, I don't know. It could be very very random. Often it's based on a lot of influences. Like if it's a sci-fi game, for instance, I have a big bunch of science fiction artists too who I really like. So sometimes it'll be kind of, I kind of want to do a bit of this and a bit of that and kind of mix them together, or at least that'll be the starting point. But I really enjoy that sort of early exploration process. And I always explain to publishers that, new publishers that I work with, that, where we start and where we end up might not look very much like each other, So, um, Black Angel is a really good example of that. Like the cover of Black Angel, for instance, that very much came out of lots of experimenting with color and shapes and things like that. And it's a sort of thing where when I started it, I didn't really have a clear idea of how it was going to look, and I just worked on it and developed it until I came across something I was happy with. It's quite a fun way for me to develop a style because it kind of surprises me as well. Um, yeah, it's a nice sense of exploration to it.
That sounds both really exciting and anxiety inducingly uncertain.
It's so no, experience has taught me that it'll come together. Like at some point in every project, pretty much, I do kind of get those thoughts of, oh God, where is this going? But I kind of know that if I just keep going, if I just put my head down and keep working on it, it'll emerge. I don't know. Sometimes it literally does that, where I'll be halfway through something and then I'll, just start. If I'm not feeling what's happening, I'll just start playing with color and just doing the opposite of what I thought would look right, if you know what I mean. So just saying, like, taking this layer in color and inverting it or reversing it, and then just seeing if that does anything interesting. And sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it does. So I have all these techniques for basically introducing chaos into the process, um, that oftentimes result in something interesting that I didn't foresee.
So you were resistant to calling your work art, which might
Mm.
also mean that, I mean, do you believe in things like inspiration, or is this something that for you is a matter of consistency, returning every day and having habits that help you tap into your more creative mindset?
Um, do I believe in inspiration? I don't know. I'm always really careful to say it's not like I don't believe it, or talent is another word. I don't believe in it, but for me, I need to work to achieve anything. So, if I, the sort of classic notion of inspiration is, you sort of sit around and think and do whatever, until something from the heavens lands in your brain. Um, but for me, I just need to work. So I work it out in a sketchbook. So I will, in early stages of developing an idea for a cover, for instance, I'll just constantly work in a sketchbook for a few hours. And if I don't have anything in my mind to draw, I'll just draw the box, like literally just a box, and then I'll just start making shapes in it. And even if they don't go, so my sketchbook is filled with just shapes, because at some stage, that's, to me, that's the same process as I just described, as sort of introducing chaos into the equation. If nothing jumps out at me as being an idea, then I just have to come across one. So a lot of the times I'll draw the box and I'll just start making shapes and things like that. And sometimes that'll suggest compositions, um, or just design concepts and things like that. So, but if I don't do that, if I just sit there and think about it, nothing will ever happen. I won't get anything done. So yeah, I need to actively work to develop anything.
So I'm assuming that there's an extra layer of work if you're doing a game that requires some historical research. Are you naturally a history buff? Do you enjoy that aspect of design? And how into historical aspects of something do you get? Or do you just look at the art? Like something like, Lisboa. Did
Hmm.
you immerse yourself in the entire situational history of the event of the earthquake, or did you just want to pick up some books about Portuguese art at that time and go from there?
Yeah, it varies. So Lisboa was quite in depth because the game had been developed with a lot of historical detail, and Vital came to me with a lot of references and things like that. So understanding the context of what was going on historically, understanding the characters, the figures involved, getting a notion for the geography and for the city itself and the culture at the time. All of that was pretty important. I mean, it's not, it is historical research, but I don't need to form a, a 360-degree understanding of the period. There's a lot of it that's just not relevant to what I'm doing. And while, yeah, to answer one of your, I do have an interest in it. It is super interesting to me, and I almost have to be careful not to spend too much spend too much time sometimes, because you come across these periods and things that you're not familiar with, and you just want to learn more about them. So I do to an extent, but there's a point at which I kind of have to go, well, all of this is really interesting, but only 10% of it's actually relevant to what I'm doing. But it really varies. Some games don't require any research, but because maybe it's a fantasy game or a science fiction game or whatever. Well, I guess even then sometimes they require a little bit of research, but it's more contextual. It's more looking at what else is out there sometimes, or just trying to find a space visually in the market almost. So that's like market research as opposed to historical research. But it really depends. A lot of the time, the research is researching like illustration styles of a certain period. So Nemo's War is a good example of that. A lot of the illustration style is based not necessarily on the period when the book takes place, but some of it's based on the period when the book would have been released and popular, like those sort of adventure styles of illustrations and things like that. Um, so sometimes that, like, a large part of the research is to do with illustration styles as opposed to actually accurate historical research.
That makes sense. So
Hmm.
you've worked on a lot of games. Is there one that you have the fondest memories of working on, or the one with the aesthetic that you sank into the most? Or is it like choosing between your children?
um, I don't know that I have. Do I have a clear favorite? I don't know that I have a clear favorite. I have a few. I did a game based on Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell for Osprey Games. I really liked how that turned out. That was based very much on historical illustration styles that I was just talking about, on sort of political maps of the time, of the era, and things like that. And also the portraits, and there's tarot cards in it. So there was lots of really juicy visual cues to sort of soak up and put into the game. So that turned out really nice. Lisboa, I really enjoyed Lisboa because it's very distinctive in the style, and it's something that I hadn't worked in before, and honestly probably won't again. I wouldn't see the point in returning to it unless Vital decides to design a Lisboa too. Yeah, lots of them. I really enjoyed Black Angel, um, because they were, as a publisher, Pearl Games were very happy for me to just go a bit wacky with it. And even some that are almost entirely graphic design exercises like Pipeline, I really enjoyed because that's a graphic design problem solving um, system of just delivering that information as cleanly as possible. So I really enjoyed that as well. So no, I don't really have a clear favorite.
So you've just mentioned graphic design. I know that a lot of times you might have a separate illustrator, a separate graphic designer. Those don't necessarily,
Mm,
the Venn diagram of graphic design and illustration is not a circle. For
right.
you, is there a specific pattern that you like? Do you tend to like to do the illustration and the design? Do you team up with other people? I mean, does it just vary per game? How do you prefer to do it, and what's most common for you?
Yeah, I definitely prefer to do everything together myself. I haven't, I don't think I've done any games just as an illustrator. I've done a few games just as a graphic designer, which is fine, but honestly, I feel that um, that's less of a unique skill set for me. I think where I excel is bringing the two together, or not where I excel, but where I do the work that's uniquely mine is when I bring the two of them together. Um, for me, because I do both in sort of equal measures, the lines between the two can be quite blurred. So I really enjoy sort of trying to just blur the line between graphic design and illustration, and that's very difficult to do if it's two different people. So yeah, for me, it's definitely I prefer to do everything at once.
So you're going for that consistent vision throughout the game.
Mm, yeah, and it's not a case where when I'm working on a game, I don't often think, okay, I'll do the graphic design now, and then okay, I'll do the illustration now. It's all kind of the same. There are exceptions to that. Obviously, if you're putting text into cards and stuff, that's a typography, which is a graphic design exercise. Um, icons tend to be very graphic design based, although again in Lisboa, all the icons are actually little illustrations. Um, so even that can be blurred, but I am yeah, I generally try to just approach them all as like a unified visual sense, if that's possible. Um, I think that leads to a much more cohesive final product.
So I know that then, if you're thinking about blurring those lines, you probably also spend a lot of time thinking about the right blend between efficiency and attractiveness to the eye.
Mm. Hmm.
Have you ever had to sacrifice some of the illustration ideas that you had in favor of making things look more simple, or because it's all one process for you, does it all just kind of evolve together?
I probably have. Yeah, kind of because it's all one process. So as I'm working on it, I'm constantly adjusting balance, right? So there's definitely been times where I've developed a piece of illustration or sometimes even just a color scheme or something like that. But once it's brought together with everything else, then something fights too hard or something doesn't pop enough where, I need to sort of like an equalizer, pretty much like a visual equalizer, where you need to push and pull certain elements forward or backwards. Um, so there's definitely been that happens all the time. So there's definitely been lots of occasions where I've adjusted things once they're in context. Um, but I can't think of a specific where I had like an idea and then I had to tone it down a huge amount. But yeah, it happens all the time, basically, in sort of small incremental steps.
So I know that when people are designing games, you play test the rules, you make sure people figure out how to play on their own or that the game works. Do you also play test your graphic design? Is that something that
Mm,
you run by other people to make sure that it's working as you intended visually?
yeah, definitely. I so when I basically when I think the game is done, I'll make a new prototype and then I'll play it with a group. What I tend to do is make a prototype but without any player aids. So almost it's like on difficult mode, because that really highlights any issues that are that are confusing or anything like that. And often, honestly, when a game goes down in front of people, and even when you're setting it up and when I'm teaching it, I'll immediately recognize things and I'll go, ah, I need to change that. It's a really, really important and helpful part of the process. And it's the sort of thing where I think, sometimes you play a game and you go, where's that information? I don't see it anywhere. Or why didn't they put the how much money you start with on the player board? It's just stuff like that you kind of go, I wish they would have done this.
Yeah, I mean, I
And
teach myself games all the time, and the easier it is for me, the happier I am.
right, yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's the sort of thing that always jumps out on playtesting the almost final artwork, um, is just those little quality of life improvements where I just kind of think, oh, I should put that there. Or somebody asks, how many of these do I need? I go, well, I tell them, and then I make a mental note, and I go, I should put that somewhere. Um, so sometimes the answer to that is, well, we're not playing with the player aid, and it'll be on the player aid.
Mhm.
But the reason that I don't play with the player aid is because I think with any good player aid and any reasonably competently produced game, you can work it out. But I don't want people. What I'm testing for is to see how intuitive it is. Um, so when I play tested Lisboa, which I play tested probably more than any other game I've worked on, the final game has a a player booklet as like a
Yes, it does, like a little menu.
four like an 8-page player aid. I didn't play test with that at all. So all of those icons I explained if I was asked, but for the most part, I just let people figure them out. Because that's really important information to me. If somebody says, "What does that mean?" I'll often say, "What do you think it means?" first, and then they'll tell me, and hopefully they get it right or at least very close. And something that's really important to me is, as the game progresses, if we're getting into the last third of the game, for instance, and especially a long game like Lisboa, are people still asking, basically, have they got to grips with the conventions? Are the conventions consistent enough that they now understand that this means a cost, this means a benefit, or you know what I mean? All those different conventions that you have in iconography and things like that. So it's a really quick and effective way for me to gauge how successful I've been in that regard. And there are always there are always super obvious things, honestly, uh, that I just don't see until I put it on the table. Um, so yeah, I absolutely have to play test final art or near final art.
How closely is that playtesting done in terms of your relationship and discussions with the designer? I can see how maybe something could arise in playtesting where you're not sure if it's a you problem or a them problem, if that makes
Mm,
sense. How
yeah.
do you decide that? Do you use the designer's playtesters? Do you have your own playtesters? Who has control over those tests and the results?
I do. It's 100% me. So I'll usually tell the designer if I'm doing it. I mean, sometimes it's opportunity just it presents itself, and I do it anyway. But I certainly will tell them afterwards and let them know how it went, both as a update on the work that I'm doing, but also just as a general playtest. I'll come back and say, you know, players really like this part or got confused at this part or whatever. Um, but no, it's 100% my initiative under my control.
So, is there any part of the design and illustration process that you do not like?
Ah, not really. No, not at least not universally. There wouldn't be any part that I'd be like, oh, I hate this part. Um, no, not really. In any project, there's definitely parts that are a bit more of a drag than other parts, uh, as you might expect. But it's not something consistently. No, not really.
Then you, sir, are a lucky man. All right,
Yeah,
one
thank
more.
God. Thank God, right?
So one more kind of worky related question. I don't.
Sure.
I'm not very sensitive to design. Actually, everybody makes fun of me because I'm very utilitarian. I will
Mm.
play a game that is not considered aesthetically pleasing. I will play a beautiful game if it works. I'm generally pretty
Mhm.
good. All right, do you find that there are certain common symbols or ways of expressing things across games that you turn to again and again because it's become so much of a part of our language of learning games that it's hard to deviate?
There are definitely conventions, and I think I'm aware of those conventions, so I know the value in using them in certain cases, but I also understand when it's not appropriate to use them, even though the meaning might be exactly the same. Like an example is in Euro games, it's very common to use like a lightning bolt for something that's immediate. It's very common, although slightly less common, to use an exclamation mark for something that denotes income. Um, and so knowing that is really useful because if I'm working on a game and I need something that denotes income, I know I can put an exclamation mark on it, and a large portion of the game's audience will understand that, and that's kind of a shortcut. But the question I need to ask myself is, first of all, is this a Euro game? If it's not a Euro game, if it's a card game or a some game about space marines shooting aliens, um, is will that audience understand that convention that is far more tied to Euro games? Um, so yeah, there's definitely some things that are really useful. I think the lightning bolt generally um, jumps out, and also ways of denoting. Although this isn't an understood convention, but ways of denoting sort of end game scoring versus immediate scoring, just stuff like that. But I don't think there's like a style guide as such that if you deviate from, it will universally confuse people. Certainly not in the ways that there are in other aspects of graphic design. Like web design is a really good example. There are certain conventions that people who live on the internet will generally understand. If you click the logo, it brings you back to the homepage. Is a generally understood convention. So I don't think we really have anything like that in board games yet.
Ah, see, yet I was actually wondering, do you find that, I mean, you've been working in board game illustration for years at this
Mm,
point. Are there any stylistic convergences that are happening as we kind of develop as a hobby, as we develop this way of, people want to buy and learn lots and lots of new games
mm,
generally
mhm.
in our culture? Is that impacting the way that games are illustrated and designed with the expectation that you have to get it right this exact time? And also, I know that players who are playing this game might also recognize these other shapes and ways, and that's an easy way to on ramp them.
Right. Um, it's really really tricky because the ins and outs. So particularly talking about iconography, and this is particularly talking about games that are reasonably complex, right? Which is where you run into loopholes and all these confusing things that you have to try and work out. Um, it's really difficult because the ideal situation when learning a game is that the iconography is as straightforward and intuitive as possible. But the iconography for Lisboa and the iconography for Venos, for instance, because of the natures of the mechanisms of those games, the simplest option won't always be the same. So a very easy example is when you talk about costs and so money. Let's just talk about money first. So a cost in money and a benefit in money, right?
Hmm.
So you've got an easy thing might be put a green border or a red border, or put a plus and a minus, right, for gaining money and having to pay money. But that runs into difficulty if you have a reduction in the cost, right? So how do you denote uh, um, a discount, right?
Right.
It's not a minus or a plus, right? Because we already have minus and plus. So you got to, that's just an extra wrinkle and an extra layer that the entire system of iconography needs to be aware of and influenced by. Whereas in the other game, we might not have that. So a plus and a minus is easy and intuitive, and people get it, and that's fine. So to if that was in any way subscribed to any sort of universal iconography style guide, then it would have to obviously take into account the possibility of having um, a reduction or a discount. But on the other game, that might make the iconography uh, unnecessarily, unintuitive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So, out of
Yeah.
curiosity, what is, in your opinion, the most beautifully designed and intuitive and attractive game that you play that you did not yourself illustrate?
Oh, huh. That is an interesting question, which I do not have an answer for. I mean, one of my favorite games from a visual perspective is the Grizzled. Uh,
Mm.
I mean, mechanically that's a very simple card game. There's not much going on, but just from a evocative and emotional standpoint, I think that game's a masterpiece. Um, Other than that, as regards sort of like information design and things like that. Oh, you stumped me. Oh God. Hmm. Nothing is that. That's not to say I don't think there are any. Don't get me wrong. But
Of
nothing's
course.
just really jumping out.
But we all know you're the
Um,
best. It's fine. No.
oh
So what are
God.
you playing right now that you're enjoying?
Well, so the games that are in constant rotation with myself and my wife are always Castles of Burgundy, Marco Polo 1 or 2, um, Newton, and Forum Trajanum. They're the games, and sometimes Concordia. They're the games that we play all the time, and Glory to Rome. Uh, so yeah, there are every week we'll play probably at least 3 to 4 of those in any order. Other than that, I haven't been playing a huge amount outside of that. Um, that's not work related specifically.
Fair enough. You're making us jealous already, though. Do you have that nice Glory to Rome, like black box edition?
Yeah, yeah, it's real beat up though. I play it a lot. It's my most played game. So, but yeah, I have a backup copy. So,
Oh my goodness.
yeah, it's no the version I have is because I don't. I really hate sleeving. Okay, this is gonna really annoy some people, I'm sure. I hate sleeving cards. Um, and I hate playing with sleeved cards. So, I would rather just buy a game again, honestly. And honestly, it doesn't bother me if a game is beat up. It doesn't bother me at all. I kind of like it in a way. So my copy of Glory to Rome is, the card edges are all frayed, but it plays absolutely fine. It's had a full beer spilt across it at Essen by a very famous designer who I won't mention by name.
Do
Uh,
it. Spill the tea. Spill the tea just as he spilled the beer.
yeah, that's right. um, who was mortified at the time, but we wiped it off and it's absolutely fine. Um, but yeah, that was very funny. Of all the games to spill beer on, and again, I'm not precious, so I was like, no, it's fine. We'll wipe it off. Don't worry about it. It's fine. If I was that precious, I wouldn't be playing it in a pub, on the table in a pub. It's fine.
You know what?
Um,
You have a point.
yeah, but everybody else around the table was mortified.
That almost makes it better in a way,
Yeah, it was
like
better
the
for
scars
me.
of battle.
Yeah, but yeah, but it survived perfectly. It's just fine.
That's a great story, and I'm really glad that you told that. So I want to thank you so much, Ian, for coming on, for taking the time to talk to me, to us. Where can we
No problem.
find you on the internet?
I'm on Twitter mostly, at Ian O'Toole tweets, and I'm on Instagram every now and then, although less so.
The illustrator who is not on Instagram. I love it.
Yeah, I just keep forgetting about it.
And as y'all know, you can find me anywhere as Beyond Solitaire. Thank you so much for listening. And Ian, thanks again for coming on. It's been great to have you.
Thanks, Liz.
Happy gaming, y'all.